Imagine operating your business for years, believing the company stands on its own, and discovering during one serious dispute that institutions never saw separation at all. To them, the business and the owner were always the same risk. That moment feels sudden to the owner, but from an institutional perspective, the conclusion was forming long before the dispute ever appeared. Today, we're going to examine something most investors never see happening. The quiet moment when institutions decide that you and your business are functionally the same risk unit. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how institutions model dependency, why classification forms during calm, and why crisis rarely creates exposure. It actually reveals it. And why separation must be observable, not merely assumed. And when I say institutions, I mean systems that have to decide whether to extend trust to your business without knowing you personally. Banks, courts, investors, underwriters, regulators. It's not about fairness. It's about predictability. Institutions don't wait for something to break before forming opinions. They observe patterns. Who signs? Who guarantees? Who stabilizes cash? Who resolves escalation? Because repeated routing becomes identity. Think of it the way that a credit score works. The score doesn't appear the day before you apply for a loan. The score forms slowly through patterns of behavior that accumulate over time. Institutional classification of your business works the same way. The decision rarely happens in one moment. It forms through repeated signals. If you're about to launch, this is critical. If you're about to launch, the patterns you established in the first years of operating are the signals institutions are going to later rely on. If you've already been operating, the uncomfortable question becomes whether those patterns have already formed. Because the first few years of operating establish dependency patterns that can shape classification long before you ever feel tested. And if you're already operating, the classification may have already formed quietly based upon repeated routing behavior. Classification rarely happens dramatically. It accumulates over time. A simple way to picture a layered structure is to think about a power strip plugged into a wall outlet. The wall outlet is the source. The strip sits between the outlet and the devices. The devices are plugged into the strip. In structural terms, ownership and continuity sit at the source. A holding layer distributes the connections. And an operating entity is where the activity actually happens. Most businesses skip the strip entirely and plug the device directly into the wall. When pressure hits the device, that pressure travels straight to the source, the owner. Now, imagine two investors. Investor one operates an entity. Every major decision requires them personally. Every financial fallback requires them personally. And every negotiation escalates to them. Investor two operates with layered authority. The operating entity binds the contracts, ownership sits above the exposure. Fallback routing doesn't immediately collapse into the individual. Both of the investors are grinding, both feel responsible. But institutions observe different routing structures. Responsibility, that's an emotional thing. But routing is structural. So if you've been operating for a while, this is usually a point where owners begin to recognize their own patterns. Because classification rarely forms during crisis. It forms quietly during normal operation, when responsibility repeatedly routes to the same place. When pressure hits, the investor feels blindsided. They say, I formed the entity, but I did everything right. I followed the steps. From their perspective, separation existed. But from an institutional perspective, dependency patterns were already established. If you're about to launch, separation has to be demonstrated early. If you're operating, separation must be observable in behavior, not just described in your documents. Institutions act on demonstrated independence, not declared independence. Those are documents. Crisis doesn't create the classification. It merely activates the classification. When the exposure escalates, the institutions apply the profile that they already built. If routing consistently led to you, then the system stops distinguishing. Another way to understand this is through medical records. A doctor doesn't diagnose based upon a single symptom. They review the entire history of the patient. Institutions evaluate businesses in a similar way. They look at the pattern of behavior over time. Not because it's looking for an aha moment, but because it models predictability. And predictability reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty, well, it increases risk. So systems choose predictability. True separation requires independent authority routing, independent financial stabilization, layered ownership above exposure, above the operating unit, and continuity beyond the individual. If you're about to launch, this is the moment to decide whether those elements will be embedded from day one. And if you're already operating, this is the moment to evaluate whether those elements are truly observable or simply assumed. Separation must be visible in the routing, not just visible in the paperwork. Institutions are not evaluating belief. They're evaluating whether the business can operate independently of the person behind it. When institutions decide that you are the business, it doesn't feel fair, but the decision usually is formed long before you noticed. Separation is not what you believe. It's what systems can verify. If authority never moved, if insulation never preceded exposure, if fallback consistently routed to you, then classification followed the only predictable path. Institutions act on accumulated certainty, not emotions, not declarations. Most owners experience this as a moment of surprise, but institutions rarely experience it that way. By the time pressure appears, the classification has usually been forming for many years. And that certainty forms quietly, long before pressure reveals it. So now that you understand how institutions classify dependency, the next question becomes even more important. What happens when structural pressure finally tests the system?